Welcome to Caddy Fab Garage. We're going to be installing our iABED Industries billet aluminum oil block today. We're going to go over kind of what it's used for, why you want it, and how you can integrate it into your swaps. So let's get to it. Alright, here we have the iABED Industries oil filter block. So I've been pretty excited about this piece, and I want to really get it on and start messing around with it. But basically what it does is the factory oil filter and cooler setup on the 07K is, not the greatest. It's all one embedded unit, so from a modding perspective, it's not very conducive. So with this block, basically what you get is it removes the factory oil cooler. So the oil filter basically just screws on right here. But also you get some nice perks. So you get to actually remotely mount the oil cooler if you want. You can do it with coolant if you wanted. You cannot. You can just put an oil cooler, basically a radiator in the front, and just run it that way. It leaves the options open. Another thing I like is, since the coolant is still technically running through this block, you can actually plumb a turbo coolant line off of this block as well, which I'm going to be running the Garrett GTX Gen 2 turbo, which has oil and water cooling, so that'll come in handy. Alright, so now I'm going to go over the ports on this oil block and what they do and kind of what's happening behind the scenes here. So on the face, you have your typical screw-on oil filter flange here. And for those who don't know, basically the way an oil filter works is oil comes in through the outside. So oil is being pushed in, and as it's being pushed in behind it, it's actually pushing it through the center of the oil filter, which actually makes it go through the filter. So filtered oil actually goes back through the center here and then gets circulated throughout the engine. So obviously this iABED oil block kind of keeps with that, and how the oil filter is designed to work. If we look on the back here, start back here. So there's a lot of ports back here, and if you're not sure what's going on, it can be a little confusing. But basically what's happening is this big hole right here, this is where unfiltered oil is coming from the oil pump. So basically it goes in this hole, and we'll turn around here. There's a port here. This doesn't do anything. It's strictly for the manufacturing process. But if we open it up, you can see, if I put my finger in this big hole, you can see it coming to the other side. So what's happening here is the unfiltered oil is coming in through here. And if we flip this over, it's coming in the outside of the oil filter. The oil filter is getting filled up and pushing it back through the center as filtered oil. So make sure you keep this on and not try and plumb anything to it. Otherwise, you'll be plumbing unfiltered oil and possibly starving your engine of filtered oil that it needs. So let's flip this back over. So unfiltered oil, filtered oil. So in this hole, out that one. This filter also comes with an oil drain bag valve, which is nice. The purpose for that is when you shut off your engine, basically the way the pressure works is oil can come out of your filter, and when you start your car, when you start your engine, it's not going to have oil available for a short amount of time. And in a race application where lubrication is really important, that could actually be pretty devastating to main bearings, rod bearings, all that good stuff. So this is a really nice touch that you don't have to worry about this. The next one we have here is this is where coolant comes in. So originally with the 07K, the oil filter block had a heat exchanger on it, and it was using coolant, just like the 180s and BR6 and any of those other engines, but it was all comprised as one unit. So what this oil block does is allows you to actually have a coolant inlet from the engine, and you can actually, if you take this valve off here, you can see there's a screwdriver here. There's a pass-through, and there's actually a designation right here that says H2O, which is pretty nice. So as I said in a previous video, if you want to use this as a, if you want to supply coolant to anything else, in my case, I'm going to be using it for my turbo, you have a nice MPT flange to do that. Last one we have here is this hole. You can see it goes straight through. This is actually for a crankcase vent, so you get a nice fitting on there. I forget the size. I'll have to look it up and post it. But you have this one, and then you have one more on the front. This is for the oil pressure sensor. You can use the stock oil pressure sensor. It's threaded to work. That's about all of it. These two holes are for mounting the oil block. These two holes are not threaded. They are passed through, and they actually pass through two threaded holes that are part of the block. So I believe in the Porsche swaps that iABED Industries really started doing, they actually use this for an engine mount. So these two holes were used to hold that engine mount as part of this oil block. So it's a real test to the strength of this full billet aluminum block, and it'll stand the test of time. One thing I do want to point out to watch out for, so on the back here, this is basically the side that will mate to the engine itself on the block. And there's this very intricate gasket going throughout here, and the one thing to watch out for is, if you can see it right here, there's this gasket that it will there's this groove that it won't fall into unless you really push it in there and make sure that you have a good seat. So when you're putting this on, just be aware that, especially here and then this one right there, you got to kind of finagle them in there to make sure that they seat correctly before you start torquing this thing down. Otherwise, you're going to ruin your gasket, which is never fun. It's recommended not to use RVT on this just because of the way it's manufactured and the way it actually seats the oil block, or sorry, the motor block. So make sure you use this gasket properly. One more thing to watch out for, this oil block does come with supplied hardware. However, it is not in the original packaging that the oil block comes in. So it's packaged like this, but this is all in here, and then these two bolts are separate. And it was they were taped in the bottom of the box. However, unless you know to look for them, I could have easily thrown it away, but I always check boxes before I do that. So if you're not somebody who checks the boxes before you throw them away for miscellaneous things, then please watch out for this. So one thing to keep in mind here, when installing this oil block with these two mounting bolts here, you don't want to go too tight. I asked for torque specs, but they said because it's going into a cast iron block, it's not too important. But since we are tightening with an O-ring on the back, you don't want to go too tight and malform the gasket and possibly get a leak. So I wouldn't go more than 20 foot-pounds on these bolts. I'd say anywhere in 15 to 20, you should get a perfectly good seal and not have to worry about things being too tight or too loose.